all of those states that were impacted by Winter Storm Fern, you will not find a lot of wind and solar that was actually powering the grid. So this narrative that wind and solar can replace firm baseload power and do it at a lower cost is simply false, and it failed spectacularly. And I would say that even in Colorado, 66% of the power came from natural gas and 19% came from coal. Thank goodness Comanche 2 was online.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy here in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host Amy Cooke. In this week's episode, we have a pretty full show because there's plenty to talk about after a weekend. We're recording this on a Thursday, so the previous weekend, as of our recording, saw Colorado and much of the rest of the country deal with some pretty nasty winter weather. They call it Winter Storm Fern. That really hammered much of the South and the East Coast, and we even got some residual effects here in Colorado. If folks were watching the Broncos game, they likely saw what that looked like in the second half of that game. It got ugly there for a second, and not just the play on the field, the weather as well. And as a result of that, you know, nerds like Amy and I, we like to watch what the grid does in those types of conditions because, as you might imagine, it gets a little tricky when the weather doesn't cooperate and you have a grid that depends fairly heavily on weather-dependent energy resources. And so we got curious and we took a look at some EIA data, the Energy Information Administration, to see what Colorado's grid looked like in those bitter cold hours. And sure enough, our fossil fuel generators performed quite admirably, and at least for one of the days, were upwards of 85% of the entire grid's electricity generation, keeping the lights on and helping to keep Coloradans warm.
Yeah, Jake, this was that last weekend, Winter Storm Fern, the innocuously named Fern.
Yeah.
Some 40 states, 2,000 miles stretched from New Mexico to Maine, went up into Canada even. But what was funny is I actually got a phone call from a friend who said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, what do you think I'm doing? Because you're watching EIA data, aren't you?" I go, "Yes, of course I am." He said, "We're all somewhere on the spectrum on this." And we were all doing it. If it weren't for fossil fuels, this would have been a disaster for the United States, not just for Colorado, but the entire United States. One of the things that we've been talking about over the last few days since Fern wound down and grid and weather and everything got back to normal is that Winter Storm Fern was really a stress test for the grid. And the grid performed spectacularly. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It kept lights on. It kept heat going. Now, there were 1 million people without power, but that wasn't due to resource mix. That was because severe ice pulled power lines down. So the grid did what it was supposed to do. And the outages were localized, and they were severe in states, especially Tennessee. But it wasn't because of we didn't have the resources or the capacity to meet demand. It was because of localized weather conditions. And then the other thing is the resiliency, the redundancy. So for instance, all of the risk was not in overhead power lines. Yes, people were without power, but because natural gas lines are usually buried, people that may have lost power may have had access to natural gas that could, their fireplace, or, maybe they could at least cook if they could override an electronic starting or ignition, or they could have hot water heat. If you made sure that your pilot light was still on, there was a way to stay warm. So to me, the grid, I look at that and I go, the grid across the entire country actually performed spectacularly. What failed, though, and there was a failure, and I would call it colossal in nature, and that is net zero policies. Just a few days before Fern, there was the governor of Massachusetts who's touting her net zero by 2050 goal. And part of that was going to be importing 20% of the state's power it was going to be clean hydro from Quebec. Well, when push came to shove, the Quebec hydropower didn't show. It didn't arrive because Quebec was buying, I kid you not, natural gas from the state of New York. And why were they doing that? Well, because they were willing to take that and that at some point would love nothing more than to sell at a profit hydro from Quebec to the Northeast. But Quebec didn't have power to sell. They were importing natural gas from the United States. And what was New England doing? They were burning oil at $600 a megawatt hour at times. It was expensive. But what that tells you is that these state policies that contribute to scarcity during extreme weather conditions because wind and solar don't show up, and you see that across the entire swath that where Winter Storm Fern, all of those states that were impacted by Winter Storm Fern, you will not find a lot of wind and solar that was actually powering the grid. It came from coal, it came from natural gas, it came from nuclear, and it came from, in the case of the Northeast, from oil. And it came from oil at a very high price. But that's what you'll do when it's cold and you can't, that's the only way to power your grid. Operators are going to find whatever resource they can, and you're going to pay a premium for it. So this narrative that wind and solar can replace firm baseload power and do it at a lower cost is simply false, and it failed spectacularly. And I would say that even in Colorado, because we looked at this in Excel's territory, 66% of the power came from natural gas and 19% came from coal. Thank goodness Comanche 2 was online. And I talked to some folks down in Colorado Springs, and they said Ray Nixon was fully operational and delivering power. Now, it wasn't scheduled to close this year, but remember that the EPA has said they wouldn't accept Colorado's state implementation plan because they didn't think Ray Nixon, the coal plant down there, should close. And clearly, this is a prime example of why it should not, until there is sufficient baseload, firm, dispatchable power that can replace it. And that isn't wind and solar.
To your point, it really was a showcase of what dispatchable generation brings to a grid and how it can benefit a grid, especially in those moments where it matters most. You point out the Colorado example, how upwards of 85% of the electricity being provided came from those dispatchable fossil fuel plants. But on the flip side, that means that our considerable renewables fleet were not performing, especially wind. Colorado is a very wind-heavy state relative to other renewables. In an annual year, you might see wind provide something like 35% of the state's generation because we just have that much wind. But when things were coldest, and frankly, we didn't even have the worst of Winter Storm Fern. It got cold here, single digits. Don't get me wrong, it was cold, but we didn't have the same problem that they had in the East Coast. And nevertheless, that wind that typically provides over a third of our power shrunk to single digit contributions during the bitterest moments of winter. And so that's why we harp so heavily, show after show, about the importance of dispatchable generation, because it really is the difference between life and death in moments like this, when the winter comes in and the weather and the temperature drops.
And it also happened in Texas. So remember a couple of years ago, Winter Storm Uri, which had deadly consequences for Texas because their generation sources couldn't power the grid, and they had severe blackouts that lasted for days, not a few hours, not 12 or 14 hours until linemen can get out there, lasted 4 days. And they were just a few minutes away from a catastrophic black start where the whole thing has to be restarted. I equate it to trying to light a fire in a forest with, you're trying to keep warm and everything around you is wet and you have no matches. That's what that is like. But even for Texas, which has the most, the installed capacity of wind in the nation, it's something like 40,000 plus megawatts of wind. It was getting maybe 5,000 megawatts of wind. So while their nuclear, natural gas, and coal fleets were operating at 85 to 90%. So wind is coming in at 12%, and sometimes way lower than that. Their thermal fleet, nuclear, coal, natural gas, were coming in at 85 to 90% capacity. I mean, they were churning. And Texas kept most of their lights on for that reason. It did have localized power outages due to wind and some ice, but this was a prime example. This was one of the most classic cases of why you do not put all of your energy eggs into an intermittent, weather-driven basket. I mean, farmers get insurance for weather. Why would we try and guarantee power through something that farmers for, thousands of years have complained about because it's so unpredictable? It's just crazy.
It is. There's a great article in Utility Dive today that we'll drop in the show notes that actually quantifies how much dispatchable energy played a role nationwide during this storm. It comes from the EIA, so it's federal data. But the headline is U.S. coal generation jumped 31% during Winter Storm Fern. And then they have a subhead that says gas generation in the lower 48 increased 14%, while solar, wind, and hydropower contributions declined from the week before. So what does that tell you? It's those dispatchable thermal assets that we talk about the importance of so often, proved their worth in this instance because they had to ramp up production and meet the moment, while those other sources that maybe we have a policy-driven shift towards failed to produce. And says they actually declined in the matter, when demand is sky high. There's a reason we harp on this stuff so often, and it just so happens that not too long before we started recording today, the National North American Grid Watchdog, NERC, released its latest long-term reliability assessment. This is another thing that nerds like you and I wait for. This is like our Super Bowl when these reports come out. And it matches a trend. We won't get into, it's a several hundred-page report. We won't get into all the details, but just a top-line finding is in their summary document, it says the overall resource adequacy outlook for the North American grid is worsening. And here's a quote from the press release. The risk of electricity supply shortfalls is increasing during winter conditions as generators with diverse fuels retire and are replaced predominantly by wind, by solar and batteries and natural gas-fired generators. So they're specifically highlighting the fact that dispatchable power plants are going offline for a number of reasons. In states like Colorado, it's usually policy mandates, and they're being replaced by weather-dependent resources that can't meet the moment when you need them to be. It's not just us saying it, folks. It's literally the folks whose job it is to monitor the electric grid's reliability saying it as well. And we saw, I think, a perfect case study as to what they're saying this past weekend.
Yeah, Fern is to your point, the perfect case study. We'll also say this. There's something else too. Parts of the United States coming in as we electrify, right? Not only are we throwing our grid into a weather-dependent basket, right? We're relying on wind and solar to power it. At the same time, we're electrifying everything.
Right.
So we're expanding the grid. We're demanding more of it, and then using a resource that can deliver less. And the worst part about this, and they say that in that comment, and it's about the winter peak. Well, we're becoming a winter peaking system. And that's where the problem is. So when it is coldest, when the weather's at its worst, and make no mistake, more people die from cold than die from heat.
Yep.
Many more people. So NERC is simply reporting what we have been saying on this show, but also really, Jake, we've been in this space for way longer. You're a little younger than I am, but we've been saying this for almost 2 decades, talking about this is what's going to happen. And net zero policies that rely on wind and solar failed, and they failed and I say this in the sort of literal, in this spectacular way. It was a big failure of net zero policies. And so, yeah, no wonder coal is 31% higher. And I'll say this, winter doesn't care what lawmakers put on a piece of paper. Winter and the grid will obey the laws of physics, regardless of what Jared Polis or any lawmaker in Colorado puts on a piece of paper. Just that they don't care. Don't care what lawmakers in Colorado want.
Which brings us perfectly to Colorado. So you would think, we saw how Colorado's grid performed when it was bitter cold and how much fossil fuels played a role in keeping the lights on. We saw what other states did, their contributions from their dispatchable fleet. And you might, the listener might say, well, I wonder if that dawned on the people in charge of setting policy and making law. Amy, you and I have talked about for a while now, sort of this draft bill, potential legislation that's been haunting us like a phantom, floating just outside of the Capitol that we've been hearing rumors about, and there was evidently going to be introduced at one point, and it was all to make Jared Polis's campaign promise of 100% renewables an actual codified reality. And in 2024, I think it was supposed to, or 2025 rather, it was supposed to drop at the end of the session. Then they pulled it, and then they said it might come back this time around. And then we started hearing rumors that enough people have made enough noise that maybe he's going to pull back and not actually go forward. Well, it just so happens that there is a document circulating amongst stakeholders that lets us know that this is still very much alive and still very much a possibility, that none of this is dawning on the people in charge of setting policy in Colorado. We're still going full bore ahead with net zero at all costs.
So this is simply repackaged. That's the only way I can put it. They rebranded Jared Polis's campaign pledge. They're not going to say 100% renewable by 2040 out loud, because they don't have to, because it's going to be 98%.
Yeah.
So they give you 2%, 2 percentage points of grace. But make no mistake, this stakeholder document, this frame, and by the way, it'll be in the show notes because we're going to post it online. I don't know that anybody has, but we are, and we're going to drop it in there and you all can read it for yourself. This is a document that should not be kept in a small circle of people, so that they each get their little, every quote stakeholder, one of my least favorite words, stakeholder meaning everybody but normal people who are just out there living their lives. So that means ratepayers are out of it. This is a death sentence for reliable and affordable power. We're moving from, now remember, right now we have, what do we say, 45%, or is it 45 or 55% of our generating portfolio is natural gas and coal. I think that in the XL region. So Let me just say it for XL. 45% on which we've spent billions is now wind and solar. During Winter Storm Fern, when we didn't get the worst of it, it was 85% of our power came from natural gas and coal. What's going to keep us warm in 2030 and 2035 and 2040? when all of these, quote, they're not mandates, they're targets.
Yeah.
To get to 98%. What's going to keep us warm? What's going to keep the lights on? And remember your clean heat plan, so you're not going to have your natural gas fireplace. Everything's going to be in overhead lines. What's going to keep us warm and what's going to keep the lights on then? I can guarantee you it won't be wind and solar. They can't build enough to do it. They can't. And it would, to build enough, well, if they did, we'd go bankrupt. And there isn't a battery that can stay on long enough. Think about how long that event went. It was, they're still having bitter cold temperatures up in the Northeast.
Right.
I don't know by the time this airs if they still will, but several days after Fern, temperatures were still cold in the Northeast. And by the way, it's January in the United States, in the Northeast. It gets cold. You should expect it. That's not unusual. This outline is they say, there's some kind of compromise. We're excited. No, it's not. It's just a rebranding.
Yeah, no, I think that's all fair to say. And we won't get too in depth on it here. If it actually drops as a formal bill, we'll go through the meat and potatoes and the details and break it down for folks. But like you said, we'll drop it in the show notes for now. But a couple things I do want to highlight before we move on is just one, it's based heavily, in the purpose section of this framework, based heavily on that Ascend Analytics report that we've talked about ad nauseum on this show, all the things that are wrong with it, all the ways that it's just an incomplete and imperfect projection of what Colorado looks like for all sorts of reasons, not even including transmission lines, not including all the various load growth projections that are up to date, but that nevertheless found that a 100% wind, solar, and batteries future was the most expensive decarbonized future for Colorado. Just pointing that out there. But then the other thing that I do want to highlight as, it's a compromise, and I would disagree that it's a good compromise, but there's one piece in there that I do want to highlight because I do think it's telling that some things are getting to those folks down there, and that is what you might call an off-ramp or a delay tactic that's built into this framework. And it says that a utility may propose to the PUC or their governing board, if they're not an investor-owned utility, to delay when they achieve these new planning targets if they say that it's necessary to comply with reliability standards, or the incremental cost of meeting the targets is higher than an average of 1.5% on their electricity rates. That's notable. How often have we talked about the fact that we've asked them, how much is this going to cost? Are you protecting ratepayers? And they've kept silent the entire time for, what is it going on, 8 years now? That this is built into that framework tells me that they're at least a little bit nervous, not nervous enough to pull back, from going full forward with their net zero plans, but they're at least a little bit nervous. And I think that's a little bit of a reason for optimism for folks who think like you and I do, and listeners of a like mind, that, hey, it's at least getting to them, what we're saying.
Yeah, so I think you're right on that. I will say that on the purpose and goals of the legislation, that you mentioned, the other part I would say, they're prioritizing emissions. One, they're also prioritizing environmental justice.
Yeah, good point.
Those two things are now superior to reliability and affordability. What we are asking the Public Utilities Commission, and by the way, also the Air Quality Control Division, because they're in there now. This is a massive. I'm going to call this it's going to be like a regulatory morass. It's going to be you're going to have air quality control. You're going to have the PUC. You're going to have social justice. You're going to have emissions. What you're not going to see prioritized will be reliability and affordability. Now, to your point, yes, they provide, if listen, if you can't make it, we're going to give you some time to delay it, but then let us know when is the soonest you can do it for us.
That's right.
How quickly can you get there? The other thing I think, and we saw this with the clean heat plan. This is why I don't have it. Again, this is on paper. The clean heat plan had a 2.5% rate cap, unless, of course, utilities couldn't meet it. And then what do? You think, okay, well, that's an off-ramp. No, well, what it is they get rid of the rate cap.
Yeah.
This rate cap doesn't include the Ascend. So it talks a lot about the Ascend Analytics study, which is so badly flawed. So flawed. And yes, we talk a lot about it. We've actually modeled it too, by the way, in our hydrogen paper.
That's right.
It doesn't include transmission costs. That's a whole nother bucket. I started to write comments on this, and I would have kept them and put them in the show notes along with everything else. But then I just realized, I sat there and said, well, yes, there are some, I guess you could call them a compromise. You go from 100% to 98. That's something. And then, you provide that idea of an off-ramp. Okay, get that. I just looked, and I sent this to a friend, and I said, this is a death sentence for reliable, affordable power. And you know what? Jared Polis won't be in office. Neither will any lawmaker that passes this. Well, unless they are, not 2040. No, they'll be at the end of their term if they're new in. If they were new in 2024, they'll be on their last term by the time this thing hits. I don't know, Jake. I have very little faith in this, but it'll pass. I'm told. Listen, I was literally told it's going to pass.
Yeah, I think you're right. After all the quote unquote stakeholding that's taken place on this bill and all the parties that they brought together, that's usually a sign in at least Colorado politics that all the special interests have made their deal and it's going to get rammed through regardless of what anyone else says. But of course, we'll know this doesn't have a bill number yet, has not been introduced yet. Once it does, there's plenty of other things in this planning document that you and I could tear apart. And so I'm sure we'll do another show on this as it actually gets introduced. And if anything gets amended or, we'll update you on that. But until then, Amy, do you have any takeaways for our listeners on this week's episode?
Yeah. One is be proud of the grid. It did what it was supposed to do. It kept lights on, it kept homes warm, and we didn't have a failure from generation resource. At the same time, make that a memory because it's going to be a thing of the past if Colorado continues on its current trajectory. And that brings me to my last point, is that firm your own grid. I spoke to a group the other day and I said, I'd always end with this. Firm your own grid because the state isn't going to do it for you. In fact, they're going to make it worse. And with that, Jake, we should probably talk about our predator right there.
That's right. Yeah. We say every single week to firm your own grid, and we want to help do our part to help you do that. And so in light of that, we're doing a little contest. If you folks like my Vanna White impression right now, as I'm showing off
well done.
The Predator, this Predator generator. In order to win this bad boy, folks, everyone listening can go to our back catalog at powergab.org. And from episodes starting at the first of the year up through the end of the legislative session, we want folks to just drop a comment in any of those videos, whether it's pithy, sincere, humorous. We get to be the biased judges to look through those comments. And, over time, we're going to gather some of our favorites. And I think we're going to whittle them down over time into, I think, a final 3 is what we're thinking. And we're going to let you, the PowerGab audience, vote on your favorite. And whoever, by the end of that period, gets voted as the best comment, we will hook them up with this brand new generator to help them firm their own grid. So, folks, I encourage you, like I said, videos starting at the first of the year up to the end of the legislative session. You got plenty of time. So make sure you brush up on your PowerGab episodes, which you should be doing anyway, and leave a comment. And hopefully you can win this super cool Predator generator.
And we're already collecting comments, by the way. We're taking screenshots. We're going to share some with you. So don't worry. We've been saying we're going to do that, but we're going to share some of those comments with you. We've found some really good ones. So we capture the screenshots. And then when we let people vote, we'll let folks vote. But here's the thing. You'll know who left that comment. So you can get your friends to vote. This is... How much do you want to firm your own grid? We'll find out.
Yeah, you can help rig the vote, and that way you can...
rig the vote. Everybody else does.
But that does it for us on another episode here of PowerGab. If folks like what they saw, they can head over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every week. We're also available wherever you get your audio-only shows, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if folks would like to reach out to us to suggest future show topics or guests they'd like to see us interview here on the program, they can send those suggestions our way at info@powergab.org. We always love hearing from you guys. But until next week, we'll see you.